the 2018 Iowa City Book Festival, presented by the Iowa City UNESCO City of Literature. We would like to thank the sponsors who made this event possible: the City of Iowa City, the University of Iowa, the Iowa Arts Council, the Iowa City Public Library, Iowa Public Radio, the Graduate Hotel, Knutson Construction, and Think Iowa City. The University of Iowa Public Policy Center supports our political and social engagement programming at this year's festival, including this reading. Between events, be sure to visit the book fair at Merge. That is right next door to us. There you can shop with artists, booksellers, publishers, and more. Author readings will happen throughout the day at the pop-up unit in the Penn Mall between the library and Merge. The vast majority of book festival events are offered without charge, but they are not free. Your tax-deductible donation gives us the ability to offer programs like this festival. Please consider supporting the City of Literature by visiting iowacityoFliterature.org/support. We encourage you to post about your experiences at the book festival on social media. When posting, please tag us and be sure to use the hashtag ICBookFestival18. Today, we'll hear from the author Dan Kaufman. Dan Kaufman is a musician and writer living in Brooklyn, New York. He has written previously about the Spanish Civil War for The Nation and the New York Times. His book, The Fall of Wisconsin, traces the history of the political heritage of Wisconsin and the overturn when the state went Republican for the first time in 3 decades in 2010. Kaufman, a Wisconsin native, has been covering the story for several years and traces how the state's tradition of progressivism was undone. Please help me welcome the author.
Thank you. It's really great to be here. I'm sure you're probably tired of hearing this, but Iowa City reminds me a lot of Madison, where I grew up and was fortunate to grow up. And it's really a very wonderful, special festival, and I'm really honored to be here to speak about this book. Unfortunately, as many of you know, the politics of Iowa have also started to resemble the politics of Wisconsin over the past several years. And those politics are the subject of this book, which kind of began in February morning in 2011, when I awoke to find a long email from my mother, who was then in her 70s. As I mentioned, I grew up in Wisconsin, and my father taught at the university in Madison. And I would not be standing here today without the many exceptional public school teachers I was fortunate to have there. But in my mother's email that morning, she described arriving home from the state capitol in Madison at 1 in the morning, having waited with hundreds of others to testify against the proposal by Governor Scott Walker to effectively break the teachers and other public sector unions by all but eliminating collective bargaining rights for state workers, with the exception of fire and most police departments. As many of you remember, Walker's action sparked a wave of demonstrations that at times exceeded 100,000 people, a 3-week occupation of the state capitol by protesters, and the decamping of 14 Democratic state senators for Illinois to block a quorum, all of which failed to prevent passage of the bill. For my mother and many like her, Walker's action was the beginning of a years-long battle to defend the state's long-held progressive ideals. For me, her emails sparked an intense period of reporting on Walker's effort that led to a series of stories for the New York Times, the New Yorker, and now to this book. The Fall of Wisconsin is the story of how a flood of dark money from national donors and organizations helped dismantle Wisconsin's century-old progressive legacy in every area: labor rights, environmental protection, voting rights, government transparency. But the book also details that legacy's profound influence on the country, and I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that side of it before I'll read a section from the book that talks about the present day. Wisconsin created the first workers' compensation program, the first unemployment insurance program, and the first progressive state income tax, among many other achievements. Much of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, including the Social Security Act, was drafted by Wisconsinites loyal to the Wisconsin idea, which is hard to define, but is a humanistic ethos that kind of placed a moral obligation on the University of Wisconsin to serve the citizens of the state. More than anywhere else, Wisconsin embodied what Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis hoped would become for the states, that is, laboratories of democracy. How did Wisconsin become such a laboratory? The roots of that tradition go back to the state's earliest European settlers, Scandinavian and German immigrants, who began migrating to Wisconsin in the 1830s and 40s. The Scandinavians left for a variety of reasons: a lack of social mobility, a desire for religious freedom, but above all, to escape economic hardship. Throughout the second half of the 19th century, and really until the passage of the Immigration Act of 1924, waves of Scandinavian immigrants fled devastating crop failures and famines. One famine that swept Sweden and Finland in the 1860s caused tens of thousands of deaths and forced people to try and survive on things like birch bark bread. The largest population of Scandinavians to settle in Wisconsin were Norwegians, whose migration rate soared in the 1840s when the Irish potato famine spread to Norway and caused the deaths of some 50,000 people. While class divisions have always persisted in Scandinavia, the struggles of the region's people to survive their harsh environment helped forge a communitarian ethos many immigrants brought to the United States. The Norwegians were particularly grateful for the freedom they found in their new homeland. In the 1840s, Norwegian migrants founded a community in Muskego, Wisconsin, southwest of Milwaukee. And in 1845, residents sent an open letter to a newspaper in Oslo proclaiming the greatest gifts of their new home. "We have no expectation of gaining riches," the letter said, "but we live under a liberal government in a fruitful land where freedom and equality are the rule in religious as in civil matters, and where each one of us is at liberty to earn his living practically as he chooses. Such opportunities are more to be desired than riches." The gratitude for that freedom led many Scandinavians to strongly embrace abolitionism. A sign of that commitment came soon after the Republican Party was founded in a one-room schoolhouse in Ripon, Wisconsin in 1854. The following year, a fervently anti-slavery immigrant named Hans Christian Heg joined the Republican Party, and 2 years later, he went to the state convention as a delegate. After the Civil War broke out, Heg organized a Norwegian regiment, the only non-English speaking unit in the Union Army, which included 115 men whose first name was Ole. Heg rose to the rank of colonel before Confederate soldiers killed him in 1863 in a battle in Georgia. Wisconsin progressivism was also forged by the enormous number of German immigrants who began pouring into Milwaukee in the late 1840s. Many of those migrants were fleeing the failed 1848 revolution in Germany and had been members of the Turners, a physical fitness movement focused on gymnastics that also encouraged intellectual development and liberal, sometimes revolutionary politics. Like many of the Scandinavian farmers, the Germans by and large held strong anti-slavery views, and the Turner movement passionately supported Abraham Lincoln's 1860 presidential campaign. Prominent Milwaukee Turners included Carl Schurz, a 48er who went on to become a Union Army general, a United States Senator, and the Secretary of the Interior. But the pivotal figure in Wisconsin progressivism was a man named Robert M. La Follette, known as Fighting Bob. La Follette was born on a farm in Dane County in the 1850s, and he would go on to serve the citizens of Wisconsin as a Republican district attorney, congressman, governor, and senator. In 1924, La Follette ran for president on his own Progressive Party ticket, capturing his home state and 17% of the national vote. But for almost all of his career, La Follette was a Republican, and the state was essentially a one-party Republican state for many decades. There was a split between the progressive Republicans and the more conservative, business-oriented ones. The purpose of government, in La Follette's view, was to alleviate economic suffering, foster equality, and encourage active citizenship to preserve American democracy. La Follette believed that none of this would be possible until and unless government limited the growing power of corporations. In this belief, he was deeply influenced by a man named Edward G. Ryan, the Chief Justice of the Wisconsin Supreme Court in the 1870s. In 1873, La Follette, who was then 18 and would go on to matriculate in the University of Wisconsin the following fall, heard Ryan give a commencement speech to the graduating class of the University of Wisconsin Law School. There is looming up a new and dark power, Ryan told them. The accumulation of individual wealth seems to be greater than it ever has been since the downfall of the Roman Empire. The enterprises of the country are aggregating vast corporate combinations of unexampled capital, boldly marching, not for economic conquest only, but for political power. His talk issued a chilling warning that marked La Follette forever. The question will arise and arise in your day, though perhaps not fully in mine, Ryan said. Which shall rule, wealth or man? Which shall lead, money or intellect? Who shall fill public stations? Educated and patriotic free men, or the feudal serfs of corporate capital? After enrolling in the university that fall, La Follette came under the spell of a second great influence, John Bascom, the chancellor of the University of Wisconsin from 1874 to 1887. Bascom believed society was a living thing, a type of organism. To maintain its health, the state needed to foster social, moral, and economic harmony. If the rich grew too rich, if workers became impoverished, if women were subjugated, society fell out of balance, and the whole of it suffered. Bascom believed in activist government to foster balance, levying taxes on corporations and the rich, accepting the right of workers to form unions and to strike, and supporting women's suffrage and the right to a university education to prevent their subservience to men. Protection is admitted by all to be the first duty of government, he said, but this protection is not that of the productive classes against the depredative classes simply, is not of society against criminals merely, but is also the protection of the weak, universally and broadly, against the strong. As governor, La Follette instituted many reforms, including direct primaries, a ban on corporate donations to political candidates, civil service protections that opened, all of which that opened the state's government to its citizens. But more than that, he concretized the Wisconsin idea, forging a close bond between the university and the state government that was really unprecedented in American history. That connection reached its apotheosis in the 1911 legislature, arguably the most progressive legislative session in American history. It saw the passage of the workers' compensation bill, state income tax, and more stringent child labor laws, among many other reforms. Passage of these laws was aided by a group of Milwaukee socialist legislators who had swept into power after a corruption scandal had tarred both Republicans and Democrats. They won 12 assembly seats, 2 state Senate seats, and the Milwaukee mayor's office, which they would hold off and on until 1960, as well as a congressional seat. With the current revival of interest in democratic socialism, it's worth remembering the long history of socialism in this country. Nowhere was that more pronounced than in Milwaukee. It was the first socialist mayor, a woodcarver named Emil Seidel, who kind of captured the spirit best of this reformist socialist movement that began to really embody Wisconsin progressivism as a whole. Some Eastern smarties called ours a sewer socialism, Seidel wrote in his memoirs. He went on, yes, we wanted sewers in the workers' homes, but we wanted much, oh, so very much more than sewers. We wanted our workers to have pure air. We wanted them to have sunshine. We wanted planned homes. We wanted living wages. We wanted recreation for young and old. We wanted vocational education. We wanted a chance for every human being to be strong and live a life of happiness. And we wanted everything that was necessary to give them that. Playgrounds, parks, lakes, beaches, clean creeks and rivers, swimming and wading pools, social centers, reading rooms, clean fun, music, dance, song, and joy for all. That was our Milwaukee social democratic movement. Sounds very easy, right? Wisconsin progressivism endured for generations, and in the 1930s, the state passed the nation's first unemployment insurance program, which became a national model. Wisconsinites like Edwin Whitty and Wilbur Cohen flooded into Washington, drafting the Social Security Act and many other reforms. The New Deal demonstrated the Wisconsin idea on a national scale and introduced really the first real social welfare system in the United States. And that resonated many decades later. During the Great Society of LBJ, Wilbur Cohen would architect the Medicare program as well. But Wisconsin has never been a thoroughly or completely progressive state by any means. As many of you know, Joe McCarthy was elected twice there. And in 1964, the Alabama segregationist governor, George Wallace, launched his first presidential campaign in Wisconsin. That campaign caught fire. Wallace won 31% of the vote in Milwaukee. And you can see the similarities between Wallace's right-wing populist appeals and Trump's, who eked out a narrow win in 2016 in Wisconsin. By and large, though, for many decades, the state's pragmatic progressivism endured, and it was often bipartisan. In 1967, Governor Warren Knowles and the Republican-controlled Senate and Assembly enacted legislation granting collective bargaining rights for all state employees. Even Governor Tommy Thompson, a conservative Republican, crafted a new program in 1999 to provide subsidized health insurance for low-income families with children. But after the 1976 Supreme Court Buckley versus Vallejo decision, which outlawed limits on campaign spending, Wisconsin's politics, increasingly shaped by money, became more like the politics of other states. That similarity would become much more pronounced in 2010 after the election of Governor Scott Walker, who rode a Tea Party wave to victory, as did many other governors and legislators in the country. Emboldened by powerful conservative groups like the American Legislative Exchange Council, Walker quickly set out to dismantle Wisconsin's progressive legacy. 2010 was also the year that saw the passage of the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision, and Wisconsin politics has never been the same since. Walker's first objective was to begin dismantling the labor movement with his attack on collective bargaining. Walker signaled the political goals of this effort even before the measure was publicly announced. 2 weeks after he was sworn in a private exchange captured by a documentary filmmaker, a billionaire donor to Walker's campaign named Diane Hendricks asked the governor if there was, quote, any chance we'll ever get to be a completely red state and work on these unions, end quote. Walker assured her that Wisconsin would change. Hendricks then asked if Wisconsin would ever become a, quote, right-to-work state. Walker responded enthusiastically. The first step is we're going to deal with collective bargaining for all public employee unions, he said, because you use divide and conquer. Since 2011, Wisconsin's union density has fallen 40%, from almost 15% of the state's workforce to 8%, the same percentage as Alabama. An extreme version of Act 10 was passed here in Iowa recently, in 2017, after Republicans seized the governorship and both houses of the state legislature for the first time since 1998. The bill, supported by a, quote, grassroots campaign run by the Koch brothers-funded Americans for Prosperity, Iowa, eviscerated collective bargaining rights like Act 10. But it also went further than Act 10 by including police and fire department unions in some of the restrictions. Then there has been the Supreme Court decision in Janus versus AFSCME, which nationalized one of the key provisions of Act 10 and may potentially starve the unions of funds and, in turn, the Democratic Party. Despite all of these defeats, I do want to stress that this book is not an entirely depressing book. And there have been some reviewers that have even described it as hopeful. And the reasons are, I think, the people that make up the heart of this book. They're by and large ordinary citizens, and they refuse to let go of the democratic ideals that Fighting Bob etched into Wisconsin. One of the things La Follette wrote in his autobiography, he said, "Democracy is a life and involves continual struggle. It is only as those of every generation who love democracy resist with all their might encroachment of its enemies that the ideals of representative government can even be nearly approximated." One of those people involved in this continual struggle is a union ironworker I met in 2012 named Randy Bryce. When I first reported on Walker's recall election, Bryce was an obscure labor organizer. 3 years later, I followed him around for several months as he kind of waged a lonely battle against the so-called right-to-work bill that Walker had promised he would not reach his desk, but did in fact sign in 2015. More recently, Bryce has become a national figure because he challenged Speaker of the House Paul Ryan for his seat and has raised more than $5 million in his campaign. But I'd like to read a little bit about this earlier battle, this right-to-work fight, which is much less well known than the fight over Act 10. And the protests were a great deal smaller than the ones over Act 10, and I think it was partly the fruits of divide and conquer. There was also a sense of fatalism that had crept in to many people, progressives in Wisconsin. Bryce and many other people, though, refused to give in, even though it was clearly an uphill battle. And I just want to read a little bit from that fight. And just to give you a little context, this is a scene that begins with the testimony over the bill in the State Assembly. And one of the fruits of divide and conquer is the splitting of the labor movement against itself. And Walker was able to win the endorsement of one of the heads of the unions, a man named Terry McGowan, the head of the Operating Engineers Local 139, which is a statewide union of 9,000 heavy machinery operators. And he endorsed Walker in 2010, McGowan did, because Walker promised to increase funding for the roads. And he stayed out of the recall race, but endorsed him again in 2014 when Walker privately promised McGowan that he would not allow a right-to-work bill to reach his desk. So I'm just going to read a little bit, and I think everything will be clear. But if it's not, you guys can holler. Also testifying against the right-to-work effort was Terry McGowan, the president of Local 139, the statewide union of heavy machinery operators. McGowan had endorsed Walker in 2010 because Walker had promised to increase highway funding and build more roads, and he supported Walker again in 2014. But speaking at a March 2015 assembly hearing, McGowan's voice cracked as he described the death 3 days earlier of Ryan Calkins, a 33-year-old union operating engineer who got caught in a drilling rig while working on a highway interchange in Milwaukee. Remember that name, Ryan Calkins, because he will just be a little blurb in the newspaper, McGowan told the legislators. 5 hours after Calkins was killed, McGowan said, he received a call from a lawyer for Calkins' employer. It needed someone who knew how to operate the specialized drill to help remove the mutilated body. McGowan sent one of his union members who had trained at Local 139's facility in central Wisconsin. Now we're talking about possibly taking training and safety away from our industry? McGowan asked in disbelief. A few days later, I went to see McGowan at Local 139's impressive new glass and steel union hall in wealthy suburban Waukesha County, a stronghold of support for Walker. McGowan greeted me warmly, but I could see he was still shaken by Calkins' death. I gained a lot of respect for the guy that I called because he made it very obvious he didn't want to do it, McGowan said. But he said he was not going to allow a fellow operating engineer to sit wrapped around that drill bit in that weather and freeze solid. You could hear his family in the background. I'm sure he was looking at his wife and kids while I was talking to him. In his testimony, McGowan described his members as beer-drinking, gun-toting, pickup-driving rednecks and reminded legislators that many of his workers are politically conservative and usually vote Republican. Local 139's special relationship to Republican politicians was made clear when Fitzgerald floated the idea of exempting McGowan's union, along with a few others. One side of the aisle likes the work we do, but not our organization, while the other side likes our organization, but not what we do, McGowan told me. Fidgeting behind his desk, McGowan rubbed his bald scalp and half smiled. I sort of trusted the guy, he said, recalling his 2010 endorsement of Walker. I took some bullets at the time from the other unions. When Walker's Divide and Conquer video was released in 2012, the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel asked McGowan about the governor's remarks. McGowan told the paper that the phrase divide and conquer troubled him. It means turning worker against worker, he said. Randy Bryce responded to Walker's push for a right-to-work bill characteristically, by organizing. Since Walker's election in 2010, he had worried about Wisconsin becoming a right-to-work state, and after the 2014 election, his fears intensified. As soon as Fitzgerald raised the idea on talk radio, Bryce began traveling to job sites across southeastern Wisconsin to warn his fellow union members about what he believed was coming. It was an old-fashioned organizing effort, talking to workers one-on-one, made more difficult by a bitterly cold Wisconsin winter. The men respected Bryce's passion, even if they didn't share it, and they would shinny down the skeletal building frames in sub-zero temperatures to take some of the flyers he'd prepared. Bryce would tell them what right to work meant and that he might ask them to join him at the Capitol one day soon. In February, that day came. Bryce went to the state capitol in Madison to testify against the right to work bill Fitzgerald had just introduced. Bryce had finally picked up some work after months of unemployment. He was unloading truckloads of steel beams to build a warehouse near Kenosha, and he needed the job. His son, Ben, was 8 years old. His debts were piling up, and a 10-hour shift paid more than $300. But the legislation, which Republicans were rushing through the state Senate, angered him enough to sacrifice the hours. Early that morning, Bryce drove his gray Mustang to the Capitol. Dozens of state troopers who kept their bargaining rights and Capitol police officers who lost theirs were now patrolling the rotunda to prevent it from being occupied as it was during the fight over Act 10. The Senate hearing room was already packed, so Bryce watched the hearing on monitors outside while he waited for his turn to speak. First came the expert witnesses. James Shirk, an economist at the Conservative Heritage Foundation, said that unions operate as cartels. They try to control the supply of labor in an industry so as to drive up its price, namely wages. But like all cartels, these gains come at the cost of greater losses to the rest of society. Greg Murad, a spokesman for the National Right to Work Committee, which has received significant funding from the Koch brothers, compared the experience of being made to pay union dues to being kidnapped and extorted. Gordon Laffer, a political scientist at the University of Oregon, noted that, on the other hand, while right-to-work laws in other states had generated no identifiable economic gains, they did drive down wages for union and non-union workers alike. Ordinary citizens got their chance to speak in the afternoon. Nearly all of them opposed the bill. A crane operator cited statistics showing that workers in right-to-work states are killed on the job more frequently. Are you prepared to be accountable for the deaths that being a right-to-work state can create, he asked. Anthony Anastasi, the president of Iron Workers Local 383, broke down in tears as he pleaded to the legislators, please think about the families that will be impacted by this. At 6 p.m., Bryce's name finally appeared on the list of coming speakers. He paced the hallway outside the hearing room in anticipation. But 20 minutes later, Stephen Nass, the Republican senator who is the chairman of the Labor and Government Reform Committee, announced that there was a credible threat of disruption and that the hearing would be adjourned so the committee could vote to move the bill forward. A labor organizer, it turned out, had told the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel that some people planned to stand up and protest at 7 p.m. when testimony was to be cut off. I went through Act 10. It was ugly, Nass said earlier in the hearing, referring to the difficulty some senators experienced reaching various parts of the Capitol after the rotunda was occupied. We had to go through a tunnel like rats. We don't want to go through that again. About 100 people were still in line to testify. A chant of "let us speak" erupted, but Nass quickly took the committee members' votes, the bill passed, and was then escorted out with his two Republican colleagues by a phalanx of state troopers. Bryce still wanted to speak. He had lost a day's wages, and the committee's two Democratic senators had remained to hear more testimony. State troopers were now blocking the door to the hearing room, though, so he decided to address a group of protesters in the hallway outside instead. My name is Randy Bryce, he began in a loud voice. I've been a member of Iron Workers Local 8 since 1997. I've had the privilege in that time to work on many of Wisconsin's landmarks, private businesses, and numerous other parts of our infrastructure. As Bryce spoke, the protesters began to quiet. He described how he had wandered from job to job after he left the Army, how Local 8's apprenticeship program had turned his life around. Finally, he presented the case against what he called a blatant political attack on his union. All of our representatives are elected, he said. All of the decisions that are made, that we make are voted on. The general membership is given monthly reports on how every dime is spent. Every dime spent is voted on. Unlike what is taking place this week, Ironworkers Local 8 is pure democracy. I am disappointed beyond words at not just what this bill contains, but how it is being passed. The following day, the full Senate took up the bill. Bryce, who had asked for another day off, took a seat in the gallery. Fitzgerald stood up and said that the bill established true workplace freedom for the first time. Such freedom, he added, has been available to most public sector workers since the passage of Act 10 in 2011. Fitzgerald continued to praise the measure until Bryce rose up from his seat. This bill is turning Wisconsin into a banana republic, he shouted, as the senators and media on the ground floor gazed upward. We were not given the chance to speak our minds. Mary Lazich, the president of the Senate, tried to quiet Bryce, but he continued talking until 2 Wisconsin state troopers approached him, placed their hands on his shoulders, and asked him to leave. Bryce did not resist, but as the troopers let him out, he kept on denouncing the bill, especially the way it was being sped through the legislature. The last words listeners could make out from the chamber before his voice faded into the distance were, "This bill is an attack on democracy." Hours after the state troopers pulled Bryce out of the gallery, the full Senate voted past the bill that would make Wisconsin the 25th right-to-work state. 2 days later, Scott Walker went to Maryland to speak at the Conservative Political Action Conference, the annual showcase for conservative activists and Republican presidential hopefuls. At a question and answer session, one attendee asked Walker how he, as president, would confront the threat from radical Islamist groups like ISIS. Walker's answer was simple and defined his worldview. If I can take on 100,000 protesters, he said, I can do the same across the world. The right-to-work bill passed the Assembly in early March, and Walker's signature came a few days later. He signed the bill at Badger Meter, a manufacturer of water flow measurement devices. He sat at a desk on the manufacturing floor, affixed with a placard that proclaimed, "Freedom to work." Paradoxically, that freedom did not extend to the employees of Badger Meter, who were not allowed to be on the floor during the signing. 2 weeks after Walker signed the right-to-work bill, Local 8 held its monthly meeting in its Union Hall just outside Milwaukee. On the way there, I drove past Miller Park, the Milwaukee Brewers Stadium, which Bryce worked on in 2000 during the final phase of its construction. It was the project he was most proud of. From the interstate, I could see the elaborate arched ironwork crowning the stadium's top. It reminded me of a photograph I had glimpsed on the wall of Bryce's home, showing him and 2 other ironworkers decking the top of the stadium. They looked tiny in the far distance, but you could tell how strong the wind was blowing from the way a tarp. You could tell how strong the wind was from the way a tarp was blowing. Bryce's grandfather, Eugene, had taken the photo. He used to drive by the stadium several times a week because he loved watching Bryce work. It was difficult to see Bryce and his coworkers, 350 feet in the air and bracing against the wind, as members of a cartel, as James Shirk, the Heritage Foundation economist, had described unions in his Senate testimony. Miller Park had claimed the lives of 3 Local 8 ironworkers who fell 300 feet to their deaths when a giant crane collapsed into the stadium on a fiercely windy day. At the Local 8 meeting straight from work, wearing mud-caked overalls. He walked into the office to pay his $53 in monthly dues and then chatted with a few other ironworkers before wandering into the meeting hall. After the men recited the Pledge of Allegiance and the recording secretary read the minutes from the previous month's meeting, the executive board began a series of briefings. The prospects for building a new arena for the Milwaukee Bucks, the restructuring of the local's dental plans, what happened at the annual conference of the International Union in Las Vegas. Last on the agenda was Bryce's political report. He stood up and started talking. He told the union workers about being locked out of the Senate hearing. He told them about the next day when he went back to protest and was thrown out of the Senate debate for shouting, "This bill is turning Wisconsin into a banana republic." He talked about his organizing trips in anticipation of right to work and the dispiritingly small crowds at the rallies. He implored Local 8's members to become more active and not to think of themselves as elite tradesmen whose concerns were distinct from those of other workers and other movements. Unions are not separate from the community, he said. We build the community, yet you're seen as the enemy, the reason people are broke. We have to stop this union versus non-union mentality. After the meeting, Bryce headed out to the parking lot. There had been some defeats, he acknowledged, but he still saw the attacks on unions as an opportunity to build solidarity. At last month's meeting, I talked about how the only way to fight back is to stage a massive general strike, he said. It doesn't need to be that, but we do need to build ourselves up to a strength where they fear that. Now they're not afraid of anything because we haven't done anything to fight back. Bryce blamed the timidity of both union leaders and the rank and file, as much as the Republicans, for allowing Act 10 and right to work to become law. People think that unions are useless today, that we're dinosaurs, he said. Well, how did that happen? We let it happen. The labor movement has become lazy because it's something that's been handed to us. He leaned against his Mustang and stared out into the industrial landscape surrounding the parking lot. A lot of guys in our local didn't see Act 10 as being important for iron workers, Bryce said, because it targeted public employees. I would ask them, how can you say there are good unions and bad unions? It's an idea that they're trying to kill. It's not the union itself. This is the strategy they're using to do it. They're splitting everything up. They're going after them first, then it's going to be somebody else, then they're going to get to us too. So, that is a passage about the right to work fight, and of course, Randy has gone on to run for office against Speaker Paul Ryan, and now his chosen kind of replacement, Brian Style. But I'd be happy to take questions now. I think there's a microphone.
Just give me 1 minute to turn it on. Hello? All right, there you go.
I want to ask about the failure of the third-party vote to collapse, right? Like Jill Stein got like 30,000 votes, right? I think there was an inevitability, maybe by the New York Times, saying, oh, Wisconsin's definitely going to go Democrat, and people felt, this comfort level of then voting for the third-party candidate that, it may have made some difference, right? Wondering if you could speak to that.
Yes, I mean, I think there's maybe somewhat of a misguided idea that these third-party votes would necessarily be Democratic votes. There was also a Libertarian candidate that may have filtered off some votes on the right. For me, the primary, there was a lot of reasons that Trump eked out a narrow victory. The result was almost overdetermined. You could pick any one. I do think that the absence of Hillary Clinton from campaigning in the state was significant. And not only that, her campaign bizarrely spent more on advertising for a single electoral college vote in Omaha, Nebraska, than in Wisconsin and Michigan combined. So as far as tactical decisions, that to me seems the most glaring. Now, there's also structural changes that Walker has instituted, for example, the decimation of the labor movement, which tends to be very good at getting people to vote. When you lose 40% of union density, that changes the electorate. There's a recent paper out now, I forget the authors, but it's cited in the book that shows that right-to-work states correlate to a 3.5% decline in Democratic turnout. That's across the board for lower-tier races. There's also the voter ID law. And even gerrymandering, which didn't affect a presidential election, it has had the effect of demoralizing people over time in their districts. So a lot of Democratic institutions have withered because they're in state assembly and Senate districts of which they'll put up a sacrificial lamb that will have no chance of winning. And I think all of these things affected it on the margins. It's also true that Trump campaigned heavily in Wisconsin, and he twinned his message of racial and nativist resentment with a defense of Social Security and Medicare, as well as railing against NAFTA and other free trade agreements, which have a lot of salience in the southeastern part of the state. So I think all of those things combine.
Although you've apparently done a good job of chronicling what happened in Wisconsin, I find missing analysis as to why it was able to happen. I mean, Tommy Thompson was governor for, I believe, 4 terms. How did that happen? Where did the liberal facade crumble to begin with? And you leave the Democratic Party, which sort of, I don't even think one can say anything positive about what went on over the past 25 or 30 years for the Democratic Party in Wisconsin. The socialists in Milwaukee did not, I mean, the best, I read this book, Lessons from the Heartland. The best thing she can say about the socialists in Milwaukee is there weren't any corruption charges, but nothing else, and it was an extremely racially divided city during the 60s. What do you have to say to those kinds?
Well, I think I do chronicle a lot of the weakness of the Democratic Party. There's also, it does address racial issues. I think Act 10, the stage was set to it. One of the union leaders in the book is a man named David Poklinkowski, who's the head of the IBEW in Madison, and he calls Walker son of Doyle. Jim Doyle was the outgoing Democratic governor who, in 2010, promised to cut 10,000 public employees, as well as after Walker's election, December 2010, said that he had cut more public employees than any governor in history. So I think rhetorically, they had paved the way for this process and this decimation, as well as there's a lot of criticism of national Democratic figures, Barack Obama, who promised that he would support collective bargaining rights if they were under attack by walking a picket line. He did not show up, nor did he support the recall opponent, besides with a single tweet on the night before the election. So, you know, I think all those things are in the book. The book is a chronicle of the recent takeover of the state by these powerful conservative infrastructure, and it's also a chronicle of the early history of Wisconsin progressivism. So,
I'm keeping a list of questions, so I will try to get everybody on there.
Hello. I have 2 questions that reflect my ignorance of unions, so I hope I don't waste everybody's time here. My first question is, the Right to Work Act says that I don't have to pay union dues. Why can't unions say, all right, you have to pay union dues, but you don't get union benefits then? Second question is, has anybody in the country tried launching a wildcat strike in the last 35 years?
so the first question is, the union is forced to use its resources to defend everybody in a unionized workplace. That's part of the problem of right to work. If there's a grievance, for example, even they have to defend a union member who is not paying union dues. We also, American labor law is very complicated, and I don't have the time to go all into it, but unlike in Europe, you cannot have a minority union. The union is elected by a majority of votes, just like the president is, and it represents that factory. Right to work is a way of hollowing out the union's bargaining strength over time. And some unions are very, some people argue, even on the left, that right to work can have a beneficial effect in that it makes the membership that's there more militant, and it can create a more militant membership. But I think it shows over time that it weakens the bargaining power of unions. And that was its intention. It goes back, it was started by a white supremacist named Vance Muse in the South during the 1940s, right, the right to work movement. He feared race mixing and the power of unions to bring together transracial solidarity. And now I'm forgetting the second question.
Wildcat strikes.
Why haven't there been any?
Yeah.
There have been. I mean, in 1970, the Postal Service had a huge wildcat strike in a sense. And in some ways, you could say that some of these recent teacher strikes were really driven, I don't know if I'd call them wildcat strikes, but I think what you have is a very atomized population in the United States, and it makes it difficult to bring people together. On top of that, you have a very powerful and robust conservative infrastructure, which includes conservative media, very adept at stoking resentment of one group against another. And Scott Walker used that tactic very successfully, and Trump has mimicked that with different victims and perpetrators. So,
So we're still moving down the list.
You've identified a number of external causes of the downfall of progressivism, such as outside money, like the Koch brothers. What would you identify are some perhaps internal problems within the progressive movement itself that perhaps has made their political messaging less salient to the average working family in the state of Wisconsin?
Well, I think it's a distance. A distance has grown between the party and the interests of working class people. And that's more of a national issue, but it's been mimicked at the state level as well. They're seeking donors. A lot of those donors have money, and their interests are not necessarily the same as labor's. And I think that is a reflection of this influx of, I think one of the key decisions in American history is Buckley versus Vallejo, which really changed American politics profoundly. Citizens United is an extension of that. But before then, you could really limit that. And you had people like Bill Proxmire, senator, a mixed bag of a senator, but he did manage to win election by spending $100. And more importantly, you could have state assembly people, a dairy farmer or something like that, win for a few $1,000s. It was Wisconsin was exceptional that way. It was very clean. And there was also a lot of ethical restrictions and so on. I mean, in the late 1970s, a state senator named Henry Dorman was hounded out of office with front page headlines across the state for charging a few $100s of personal phone calls to the state. This was like the biggest scandal in decades. And it was amusing and funny, but also a reflection of how the Lafayette deeply ingrained this tradition of keeping that out. And unfortunately, the federal courts have really limited that. And that has affected, I think, the Democratic Party's affiliation, which started with the Clintons in the 90s, I think, really in earnest. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Can you describe a little bit about religious communities and any work you've done, that storyline of how religious communities what role they've played in Wisconsin?
Well, one of the people, this part I didn't get too deeply involved in. I mean, a book, you're always limited, and your editor doesn't want it to be 1,000 pages for various reasons, which I can understand. But I do talk, a wonderful woman, a professor of Scandinavian studies at Wisconsin, who left partly because of the attacks on the university, is now in Utah. She talks about the Scandinavian kind of Lutheran tradition and his sort of communitarian spirit. More recently, the Wisconsin Right to Life movement was kind of a precursor to that. Became very active in the 90s and kind of was a precursor to the Tea Party wave in some ways, even though Tea Party wasn't ostensibly focused on social issues. So I think, and Walker himself comes from, he's the son of a Baptist minister who went to Marquette and told a fellow student that, God has put me on the earth to cut taxes and stop killing babies. That was his quote to this man. And I think, Wisconsin has a religious right that's become active. Paul Weyrich, one of the architects of the New Right from the 60s, and founded the Heritage Foundation, as well as essentially founded the American Legislative Exchange Council, was from Racine and from a religious background, a working class person with a great deal of grievance. So I don't know. I mean, I think there's different strands. At the same time, a lot of religious communities have been active in the sanctuary movement. My own synagogue growing up in Madison was one of the only synagogues in the country to, have people stay there. So, but I think by and large, it's been a focal point, particularly the Right to Life movement has been strong in Wisconsin and started to erode that progressivism. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting, the right to life things that you speak of. An analysis of the right to life, is right to life a lot of times a proxy for other things? Like, do you believe the right to life movement believes that it would affect one group or one ethnic group or one type of group more? So you can say I'm for right to life, but in reality you're you're believing like Hispanic people have more kids, and if I make it harder for them to get abortions or something like that, then I can affect that group? Or is it truly, or is it just truly that they believe in the right to life?
I think I'm the wrong person to ask. I'm not an adherent to that movement. But I think, there's been feminist scholars that have argued it's a form of patriarchal control. And whether or not it's targeted at certain populations, I don't know. I think everyone has their own reasons, and some of them, I'm sure, are sincere religious ones. It's a central tenet of Catholic theology, as is the social justice message, which is often ignored by people like Paul Ryan, who, purports to be. There was a funny scene when I was reporting the book of watching they had a town hall in Racine, and he was becoming a little bit worried about the challenge from Bryce, and I was sitting watching at a bar, and I don't know if you remember this town hall, but there was a nun that basically castigated Ryan for not adhering to a social justice tenet and taking care of the poor and so on. And anyway, there was a tweet that went around that Ryan, he sort of mansplained poverty to a nun. And anyway, it got a lot of laughs. And he it's he really embodies this radical libertarian ideology, which is either sincere or a cloak for something else, but it is very pernicious in Wisconsin and everywhere, where the idea is that everybody is self-made and you're just on your own, and by actually taking away, some modicum of welfare benefits to people, you're freeing them from this servile, relationship. So, but he really, that is a central tenet of his views. So.
Can you speak to how public education was affected by all this?
Yeah, question was, how was public education affected by all this? Hugely. There's been some recent research from a professor at the University of Florida, a doctoral thesis about the effect of Act 10 on math and science results in Wisconsin scores. And what's happened is you have a kind of free agency that's emerged in Wisconsin, where the wealthier school districts will poach teachers from rural schools and so on, and leaving the rural schools to scramble. And this person found that math and science scores have declined perceptibly in lower performing schools. It's become more uneven. They can offer better wages and benefits than these rural schools. The other thing that's happened is you've had a tremendous decline of interest in pursuing education. The University of Wisconsin's application, the education department's application, has dropped by 2/3 since Act 10. So it's harder to get people to want to become teachers. And the state had a long tradition of real investment in the belief in public investment, particularly in schools. That said, I think some of this has become, it's become a political problem for the Republicans and Walker. And in fact, he restored like $650 million in the budget last year. His opponent is a man named Tony Evers, who's the state superintendent of schools. And schools are one of the schools and the roads have become the real flashpoint of whether this libertarian experiment has gone too far. And there is a backlash, particularly in these rural districts, because a lot of schools are closing, or they'll have to have these continuing property tax resolutions to raise property taxes to keep their school open. In fact, the elementary school in Walker's district, not the one he went to, just closed last year because they had passed a series of these resolutions, and finally one was voted down and they had to close the school. So.
Just a subscript to your talk here. I served in the Iowa legislature for 3 terms, and I was on the subcommittee that wrote the collective bargaining law for the state of Iowa. And I just wanted to say that basically what we did is we had the Legislative Service Bureau go to Wisconsin, and we actually took their law and had some of them come over and testify in our subcommittee. and we basically wrote the law, and also the whole thing about the mediation process. If you go through it and would compare the two, you'd find that basically we pretty much copied those two. Second little subscript, you're talking about money in politics. When I ran, and I came from a rural county, I was Chickasaw County up in that northern part of the state. It cost me $3,000 to run a campaign for a state legislator. And I used to make it by having little suppers for $25 and people throwing the $25. And, but anyway, Wisconsin had a great influence upon us. I might say we had one other thing I remember about the legislature. There was a legislator sat right behind me, came in the same year I did. His name was Branstad.
Any comment to that?
Well, yeah, that was a great comment, and thank you for reminding me also, that Wisconsin for a long time was a different kind of laboratory for other states. The workers' compensation bill was replicated in dozens of states. The state income tax, that's where these laws were, and then some people said that the New Deal was basically Bob La Follette's 1924 platform writ large. It was that kind of place, and they crafted these laws very expertly, and a lot of previous efforts to pass an income tax had failed because politicians were too unwilling to collect the tax, but they did it very, very carefully in Wisconsin, and so it was clear that most of the money was going back to the local communities. People could see what it did. It was done very progressively, so wealthier people paid more, and it became the first successful one, even though there had been other attempts, but none of them had worked. So it was that, and collective bargaining was the first state to recognize public employees' collective bargaining rights. So, yeah.
As one fellow Badger to another, can't you tell by the uniform? Speaking of Miller Park, go Brewers. I have to let everybody know that everybody in this town's a Cub fan.
Wow. Yeah.
At any rate, growing up as I did in Milwaukee, I saw its wealth, its high standard of living, and its heavy industry. Alice Chalmers, Gopher Blocks, International Harvester in Menominee River Valley, Cutler Hammer, A.O. Smith, all gone.
Yeah.
And those were union workers. My father, speaking of IBEW, International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, worked at Square D. Newspapers would always come in, the labor newspapers, staunchly Democratic. That's been waning for years. Yeah. And there was a vacuum there, and Trump was slick. How'd he win the election? The loss of good union-paying jobs, heavy industry, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania. How does that factor in all this?
Yeah, I agree with your comment wholeheartedly. Milwaukee was one of the largest manufacturing centers in the country with huge numbers of union jobs. A lot of automation was a factor, but these free trade deals were a huge factor. People can point to this factory moving to Mexico or that one going to Vietnam, and it has hollowed out that area. As you say, Trump was very effective at appealing to them, and in fact, I saw him give the address to the National Conference of Building Trades in 2017 with Randy Bryce sitting there. There is a continuing effort to divide and conquer the labor movement. His efforts in Carrier and so on and so forth, whether they're simply PR, but they can be effective. He lost the union household vote only by 8% nationally, which is not enough for a Democrat to win. Reagan lost only won slightly more than that, and that launched the whole Reagan Democrat kind of constituency, and he has really been able to replicate that to a degree. So.
So unfortunately, I was told we only have time for one more question. John said he would be the bad guy. So here's the last person on my list.
Thank you. I remember that Wisconsin elected a Democratic person to the Supreme Court recently. And my question is, you did mention that there were some hopeful signs, and that's what I wanted to ask you about. What signs of hope do you see on the horizon?
I always get this question. It's always the hardest question everywhere I've been speaking about the book. Well, That is true, and maybe even more significantly, there was a woman named Patty Shackner that won a state Senate race in a western Wisconsin district that Trump had won by 18 points, and she was a Democrat. I think there's fatigue with divide and conquer. And Trump's numbers are very low in Wisconsin. They're in the mid-30s, and that, I think, is also dragging Walker down. And again, there's fatigue with this hollowing out. It's been a nonstop cutting of the public sphere that is eventually really, people are very aware of it. The roads, they're called Scott holes. The potholes are called Scott holes. So they, it is reaching its denouement. That said, I don't, you want to temper the hope with the understanding that even during a more sympathetic era, it took 3 decades to get collective bargaining rights recognized for public employees, and the Republican infrastructure is as strong as ever. And I think that until the Democratic Party or whoever the opponents of that are start defeating the donors of that infrastructure, the gains will be short-lived. So.
All right, so let's thank Dan Kaufman.
Thanks, John. Thank you, John.